This is Philosophy for Chads, Episode 2, on the Philosophy of Philosophy podcasts. Some people might say that philosophy podcasts, a recent phenomenon since the rise of the internet, are irresponsible scholarship, that perhaps philosophy, a notoriously complex and difficult discipline, requires a responsible and dedicated approach. Requires scholars who are devoted to carrying the sacred flame, being honest and curious about the texts, and making sure that their pedagogical materials are carefully chosen and carefully constructed. You might have learned this if you went to a liberal arts school, for instance, such as Smith College or Reed College. However, let's take a step back and look at the history of philosophy. The question we're going to ask about history today is, who is on the right side of it? Is it the podcasters, or is it the credentialist professors and professional scholars? Let's use an example that is, in fact, the favorite of philosophy professionals the world over. Socrates' Athens. Socrates, as we all know, was a bit of a provocateur. He would famously approach randos in the market of Athens and accost them, asking them to defend their beliefs. Well, first of all, state their beliefs, and then defend them in a Socratic engagement. The type of engagement itself bears his name. In fact, he was so dedicated to being this kind of, let us say, gadfly, that he didn't even write his own teachings down. It had to come to Plato to do such a thing. Now, I have to ask, in the Athenian democracy, which was, of course, a democracy, a functional institution, a place that issued credentials to priests and politicians, people who were allowed to profess the state religion and the state philosophy, and who condemned these characters known as the sophists, who charged quite a lot of money, much like gurus on the internet might charge money for passive income scams today. But Socrates was not a guru. He was not a sophist. In fact, he argued very strongly against them. Socrates was put to death by the Athenian state on the accusation that he, too, was a sophist. He talks about this famously in his Apology, again, recorded by Plato, not by Socrates. Now, Socrates had an approach that recognized no authority, no state, no credentialist kind of cabal. He believed that the truth, the real truth of being, came forth from a dialectical engagement. You tell me what you think is true, and we dig into why. No one is qualified or unqualified to do philosophy. And yet, it's the credentialist professors who insist that, based on their ability to teach Socrates, the provocateur, the gadfly, it is they who are the sole authorities, responsible scholars, credentialed experts on teaching philosophy. Now, what would Nietzsche say? Nietzsche, noted Chad philosopher, actually seems to have had it out for Socrates. He believed that Socrates was kind of a little bitch. The problem with Socrates was he was not an aristocrat. He did not have a style of life that was actually enviable. In fact, he smelled bad. He refused to accrue any material wealth. He had a highly non-enviable lifestyle by any real aristocratic standards. Now, if you go and you read the Phaedo, some other dialogues, Socrates has a very coherent account of how the soul is immortal and transmigrates, and after you die, if your soul was perfected, it floats around in shape heaven for 10,000 years before returning to some other body. And you can go with that. It's kind of ridiculous eschatology. The point is that in this life, Socrates lived a smelly one. And you have to wonder, what kind of Greek aristocrat was even interested in carrying on this kind of argument? If you really believed in the kind of life you were living and the truths that you embodied, what's the point in having to argue it? What's the point in having to... I mean, that is the pauper's argument. That is the last thing a man has after surrendering all of his material wealth and earthly influence. But in spite of all of this, in spite of thinking that Socrates was kind of a little bitch, Nietzsche still sides with the sophists. He doesn't side with the Athenian democracy. In fact, he thinks that the state is a cold-blooded, lying antagonist. He thinks that it's vastly inferior to even the Catholic Church as a power structure. So, drawing from the two real philosophers in history, as Nietzsche would call it, both of our Chad brethren believe it's the Athenian state who's in the wrong. It's the sophists, or Socrates, maybe they're the same thing, but it's the people who believe in themselves and in dialectical elicitation of the truth who are in the right. Now, this is all very interesting. What becomes even more interesting is when we look at the podcasters versus the professors. The question remains, are the podcasters the sophists? Are the podcasters the Socrateses of the world? How do we know that a podcaster who's able to reach potentially millions of people in a sort of artificial absence is really doing the same thing as Socrates? Socrates sought to save one soul at a time through an interpersonal engagement. But a podcaster simply says some provocative nonsense and reaches millions of communist insurrectionaries or incels or what have you. Why should we side with the podcasters, believing that they're any different from demagogues or tyrants? The answer, of course, is don't be a bitch. We have a digital commons. We have a mode of free association within the digital sphere that, yes, is heavily regulated. Look at how YouTube clamps down on the likes of Alex Jones and so on. Don't you believe that these internet regulatory institutions, these platforms provided protections by United States law, have some vested interest in their own continuation? Don't you believe that the polis, unjust and tyrannical as it may be, still has to host the market within its walls? No. The fact is, if you smash the gadfly, if you shut him down, well, maybe he was a bad nut. Maybe he was a bitch and a fascist. Maybe he was a totalitarian insurrectionary. I agree. Those people are weak. They don't deserve our attention. And frankly, it is all the worse that they attract these odious mass audiences. But nonetheless, I ask you, between the market and the polis, government, between the market and the city council, the market and the temple, what do you choose? Choose the Chad option.